I had just signed the biggest contract of my career when the past walked straight back into my life, pregnant and shaking. The restaurant was loud with celebration, glasses clinking, laughter bouncing off the polished wood walls. My business partners were still talking about profit margins and timelines, their voices full of confidence. But none of it reached me anymore, because standing right in front of me, holding a silver tray that trembled in her hands, was the one person I had buried deep in memory. My wife, the woman who had vanished from my life years ago without a word. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant, everything froze, the noise, the movement, the celebration. Her face drained of color so quickly I thought she might collapse. One of the glasses on her tray tilted dangerously, liquid sloshing to the rim before she caught it. "You?" she whispered, barely audible over the noise around us. "Why are you here?" Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was afraid. And that was what unsettled me the most. I leaned back slightly in my chair, forcing calm into my expression, even though my heart had begun pounding against my ribs like a hammer. "Yeah," I said quietly. Just that one word. But the moment it left my mouth, I knew this night had stopped being a celebration. It had turned into something else entirely. Unfinished business, buried questions, and a past that refused to stay buried. She didn't stay long. Another waiter approached from behind, murmuring something urgently into her ear, and she nodded too quickly, stepping away from our table without finishing the order. The tray shook again as she turned, disappearing toward the kitchen doors like someone fleeing danger rather than embarrassment. I sat frozen for a second longer than I should have. Around me, my partners kept talking, oblivious. One of them slapped the table, laughing loudly about expansion plans, about how this new contract would finally push us into the next level. Normally, I would have been right there with them, confident, focused, already calculating the next move. But my mind was somewhere else, back in a life I thought had ended, back to the day she disappeared. I forced myself to breathe slowly, pretending to listen, nodding at the right moments. But my eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen door, waiting for it to swing open again. It didn't. Instead, a different waitress appeared moments later to take over our table. Her smile overly polite, her tone rehearsed. "Sorry about that," she said quickly. She had to step away. Had to step away. Not chose to. Not left. Had to. The wording stuck with me. I studied her carefully. There was tension in her shoulders, a stiffness in the way she avoided meeting my eyes directly. She spoke too fast, moved too quickly, as if finishing this task meant escaping something uncomfortable. "Is she coming back?" I asked casually. The question sounded harmless, but the moment I said it, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of nervousness that vanished just as fast. "I'm not sure," she replied. "She's not feeling well." Not feeling well. Another excuse. Another answer that felt prepared. I nodded, pretending to accept it. But inside, something twisted, because that wasn't the reaction of someone embarrassed to see an old husband. That was the reaction of someone afraid. And fear meant there was more to this than abandonment. Years ago, when she disappeared, there had been no shouting match, no dramatic fight. That was what made it worse. The last night we spent together had been strangely quiet. Too quiet. I still remembered walking into the bedroom that morning and noticing the closet door slightly open. Half empty. Drawers cleared. Her favorite coat gone. But the wedding photo still sat on the dresser. Her jewelry box untouched. No note. No explanation. Just silence. I had called her phone again and again until the battery died in my hand. I checked airports, contacted friends, even filed missing person reports before the truth settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. She had left. Or at least, that's what I believed back then. Now, watching the kitchen doors, seeing how quickly she vanished, how terrified she looked, I wasn't so sure anymore. A sudden movement near the counter caught my attention. The restaurant manager stood near the kitchen entrance. arms crossed tightly across his chest. He glanced toward me once, just once, before looking away far too quickly. That single glance lasted less than a second. But it was enough. Enough to make my stomach tighten. Enough to tell me this wasn't coincidence. Something about this entire situation felt controlled, rehearsed, monitored. I forced myself back into the conversation at the table, laughing at something I hadn't even heard. But beneath the surface, my thoughts raced, replaying every detail from the past few minutes. Her shaking hands, her pale face, her whisper. Why are you here? Not why are you back? Not why now. But why are you here? As if she never expected to see me again. As if seeing me here tonight wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Dinner dragged on longer than I wanted. Every minute felt stretched. Heavy. Suffocating. My partners ordered dessert. Still celebrating. Still riding the high of our success. Normally, this would have been my moment. The night that proved every sacrifice had been worth it. Instead, it felt like something else entirely, like standing at the edge of a cliff without realizing how far the fall might be. Eventually, the plates cleared, and the conversation shifted toward final toasts. Glasses lifted. Laughter echoed. But my attention stayed locked on the kitchen doors. Then finally, I saw her again. Just for a second, she stood near the back hallway, speaking urgently to the manager. Her body leaned slightly toward him, hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, protectively, instinctively. Pregnant. The reality of it hit me again, heavier this time. Her head turned suddenly, scanning the room like someone checking for threats. When her eyes briefly met mine again, something passed between us, not anger, not regret. Fear. Real. Unmistakable fear. Before I could move, she turned and disappeared down the hallway. Gone again. The dinner ended shortly after. My partners left in good spirits, clapping my shoulder, promising calls in the morning. I smiled, nodded, played the role they expected. But inside, something had already shifted. I didn't leave with them. Instead, I remained seated, staring at the empty doorway long after the noise around me faded. Eventually, I stood and walked toward the counter. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "The waitress who was serving our table earlier, where did she go?" The manager looked up slowly. "Too slowly. She already left," he replied. But as he spoke, my eyes drifted past him, toward the back hallway. The metal door at the end of the corridor was still moving slightly, swinging back and forth as if someone had just pushed through it seconds ago. A cold wave rolled through my chest. I didn't say another word. Instead, I walked straight outside into the night air, scanning the alley behind the building. Empty. Silent. No sign of her anywhere. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold, trying to steady my thoughts. After years of silence, after years of believing I had been abandoned without explanation, the past had just walked back into my life, pregnant and terrified. And for the first time since she disappeared, a thought surfaced that refused to leave. Maybe she hadn't left because she wanted to. Maybe she had left because she had to. The alley behind the restaurant smelled like wet asphalt and salt from the harbor. And I stood there longer than I should have, staring into shadows that offered no answers. The cold air pressed against my face, sharp enough to wake my thoughts, but not enough to calm the pounding in my chest. I scanned the narrow alley again, dumpsters lined against brick walls, a flickering security light humming faintly overhead. No footsteps, no movement, nothing, except one thing. The side door. It was still slightly open. Not wide. Not obvious, just enough to sway back and forth in the night breeze, tapping softly against the frame like someone had rushed through it seconds earlier. I stepped closer, my boots echoing faintly against the pavement. Every instinct inside me said this wasn't over. Not tonight. Not after 8 years of silence. I pushed the door open and stepped back inside. The noise of the restaurant swallowed me again. Laughter. Music. Glasses clinking, but everything felt distant now. Muffled. like I was walking through a dream where nothing moved quite right. The manager noticed me immediately. His shoulders stiffened. That alone told me more than any words he could have said. "I thought you left," he said, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for her," I replied calmly. "The waitress who was serving my table." He wiped his hands on a towel, avoiding my gaze. "She went home," he said quickly. "Wasn't feeling well." Too fast. Too smooth. Like he had practiced that sentence before I even asked. "Home," I repeated. "Already." "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Left a few minutes ago." A few minutes ago? But the alley had been empty. And that door had still been moving. I let the silence stretch between us, long enough to make him uncomfortable. Behind him, I noticed 2 other waitresses standing near the counter. One of them glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away, whispering something to the other. They weren't just nervous. They were afraid. "What's her name?" I asked. The manager hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. "Why?" he asked cautiously. "I'd like to check on her," I said. "She didn't look well." Another pause. Another flicker of tension. "Her name's Claire," he said finally. Claire. Not her real name. I knew that immediately. 8 years of marriage teaches you more than just birthdays and favorite meals. It teaches you instincts, the kind that whisper when something isn't right. And nothing about this felt right. One of the waitresses behind him accidentally spoke up before she could stop herself. "You mean—" She froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening as the manager shot her a sharp look. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. "You mean Claire?" the manager corrected firmly. The waitress nodded quickly, looking down at the floor. But the damage was done. They weren't just covering for her. They were hiding something. I stepped slightly to the side, pretending to glance around casually. But what I was really doing was observing the dining room, the hallway, the ceiling. That's when I saw it. A small surveillance camera mounted above the kitchen corridor, angled perfectly to capture every movement in and out of the staff area. The lens rotated slowly, mechanical, deliberate, watching, recording, tracking, and suddenly, everything felt less like coincidence and more like containment. Like someone was making sure she stayed where she was supposed to be, or left when she wasn't. I turned back toward the manager. "Strange," I said quietly. "What is—" he asked. "She didn't look sick," I replied. "She looked scared." His jaw tightened. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just enough. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. "Who is she hiding from?" That question hit harder than I expected. His eyes flickered again, this time toward the hallway, before snapping back to me. "I'm sorry, sir," he said stiffly. "I think it's time you leave." Not an answer. A dismissal. Which, in my experience, usually meant I had asked the right question. I nodded slowly, stepping back. "Of course," I said. But I didn't leave immediately. Instead, I lingered near the entrance, pretending to check my phone while watching reflections in the glass windows. That's when I saw it. The manager pulling out his phone, typing quickly. His fingers moved with urgency, not casual, not routine, deliberate. He wasn't texting a friend. He was reporting something. Reporting me? A cold realization settled into my chest. My presence here hadn't gone unnoticed. And somewhere, someone was being informed that I had seen her, that I had recognized her, that I had returned. I stepped outside again, the night air heavier this time, pressing against my lungs like warning. I walked slowly toward my car, parked just beneath a broken street lamp that buzzed faintly overhead. My hand rested on the door handle, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I replayed memories I had buried years ago. The last weeks before she disappeared. The sleepless nights. The quiet tension that had crept into our home like a slow-moving storm. I remembered her standing by the kitchen window late one night, staring into darkness like she was expecting someone to appear. "You okay?" I had asked. She had turned toward me too quickly, forcing a smile that didn't match the fear in her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "Just tired." But she hadn't been tired. She had been scared. I remembered that now. Remembered the way her phone used to buzz at odd hours, messages she never opened in front of me. The way she started locking doors twice before bed. The way she jumped at unexpected sounds. And then there was that one moment. One sentence she had whispered months before she vanished. "If anything ever happens, don't trust what they tell you." At the time, I thought it was stress. Financial pressure. Family drama. Now, standing in that cold parking lot, those words echoed louder than ever. Don't trust what they tell you. I exhaled slowly and finally opened the car door, sliding into the driver's seat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cold metal. My hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers tightening unconsciously. Something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Movement. Not behind me, but near the back of the building. A small piece of paper lay on the ground near the staff exit door, fluttering slightly in the breeze. At first, I ignored it. Probably trash. Probably nothing. But something inside me, that same instinct that had kept me alive through years of rebuilding, refused to let it go. I stepped out of the car again and walked slowly toward the door. The paper shifted slightly as I approached. Folded once. Not crumpled. Not dirty. Placed. Deliberately. I bent down and picked it up. It was heavier than expected. Thick paper. Not cheap receipt material. I unfolded it carefully. 3 lines. Nothing more. Tomorrow, 9:30. Warehouse District. No name. No explanation. Just instructions. I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling my pulse begin to rise again. Was it dropped intentionally? Or lost by accident? And more importantly, was it meant for me? I folded the paper slowly and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Back inside the car, I sat in silence, staring straight ahead through the windshield as the restaurant lights glowed faintly behind me. This wasn't random anymore. Not the reunion. Not the fear in her eyes. Not the manager's reaction. And definitely not this. Something bigger was unfolding. Something that had started years ago without my knowledge. For the first time since seeing her again, the shock began to fade. In its place came something colder. Something sharper. Strategy. I started the engine, the sound breaking the silence like a warning shot. As the car rolled forward, the restaurant lights grew smaller in the mirror behind me, fading into darkness. If she left me once out of betrayal, I would have survived it. But if she left because of fear, then someone else owed me answers. The streets grew quieter the farther I drove, the city lights fading behind me like a memory I wasn't ready to lose. I checked the folded paper again at a red light, reading the same 3 lines that had been burning into my thoughts since I found it. Tomorrow, 9:30. Warehouse District. No name. No explanation. Just a time and a place that sounded like trouble. The next night came slower than I expected. Every hour dragged, heavy with questions I couldn't silence. I barely slept, replaying the fear in her eyes again and again, the way her voice trembled when she saw me, the way she vanished like someone running from danger instead of shame. By the time 9:30 approached, my mind was sharp, alert, restless. I drove toward the warehouse district with both hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The streets shifted from crowded storefronts to long stretches of empty pavement. Streetlights grew farther apart. Buildings became taller, colder, more industrial, and emptier. Too empty. That's when I noticed the car behind me. At first, it was just headlights in the mirror. Nothing unusual. Just another vehicle moving through the same streets. But when I turned left, it turned left. When I slowed, it slowed. A tight knot formed in my stomach. I tested it once more, making a sudden right turn onto a narrow side street I normally wouldn't use. The headlights followed. Not aggressively, not recklessly, just quietly, steadily. Watching. Following? My pulse climbed higher. But I forced myself to stay calm. Panic would only make mistakes easier. After 2 more turns, the car continued straight while I turned again, finally disappearing from view. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. But the unease didn't leave. When I reached the warehouse district, the air felt colder somehow, heavier, like the night itself was holding its breath. Rows of old industrial buildings stretched along both sides of the road. Metal siding rusted in places, windows coated in years of dust. Most of them looked abandoned, forgotten by time and progress. I parked beneath a flickering streetlight and shut off the engine. Silence settled instantly. No traffic, no voices. Just the low hum of distant machinery somewhere beyond the darkness. I stepped out of the car slowly, the sound of my boots echoing against cracked pavement. Ahead of me stood the building listed on the paper, tall, gray, featureless except for a single metal door near the center. Above it, one weak light buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that shifted with every movement. I checked the time. 9:30 exactly. Not early, not late. Right on time. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw movement. A shape behind one of the upper windows, faint, blurred by dust and darkness. It appeared for just a second, then disappeared. Someone was inside, watching. My instincts screamed at me to leave. But I didn't. Not after 8 years of silence. Not after seeing her again. Not after realizing the past wasn't finished with me. I took one slow step forward, then another. The sound of footsteps behind me made my body stiffen instantly. I turned sharply. She stood there, alone, closer than I expected. Her figure looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, more fragile. Her face, illuminated by the weak overhead light, carried exhaustion I had never seen before, and fear, real fear. Her hand rested instinctively over her stomach, fingers curved protectively. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us like something alive. Then she whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "You shouldn't have come." Her voice cracked slightly. Not angry, not bitter, afraid. "Then you shouldn't have left," I replied, my tone steady even though my chest tightened with every word. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the empty street behind my shoulder. Watching, checking, like someone expecting danger. "You're not safe here," she said urgently. I'm not safe. You're not safe." That choice of words settled deep inside me. "Start talking," I said. 8 years. No explanation. No goodbye. You don't get to disappear like that and expect silence forever. Her gaze dropped briefly before returning to mine. I could see tears forming, but she blinked them back quickly, refusing to let them fall. "They're still watching," she whispered. The words landed like a stone in my chest. I repeated. She shook her head slightly, glancing over her shoulder again. "Always watching, always listening. I can't explain everything," she said. "Not here." Anger flared inside me, hot, sudden, uncontrollable. "You think that's enough?" I snapped. "You walk out of my life without a word. Leave me buried under debts, rumors, failure, and now you expect me to just trust you again." She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. Instead, she lowered her head slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. 2 words. Soft. Broken. Unexpected. The anger inside me stalled, confused by the quiet honesty in her voice. "You were never supposed to see me again," she added suddenly. That sentence hit harder than anything else she had said. "What does that mean?" I demanded. Her hand shot forward unexpectedly, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers trembled. "They made sure of it," she said. "Made. Not chose. Made." A distant engine sound echoed somewhere down the street. Her body stiffened instantly. The fear in her eyes deepened. I followed her gaze and saw headlights appear at the far end of the road. Small at first, barely visible, but growing brighter with every passing second. She stepped back quickly, releasing my wrist. "You have to leave," she said urgently. "I'm not leaving," I replied. "You don't understand," she insisted, panic rising in her voice. "This child is why you need to go." The word child hung in the air between us. Heavy. Dangerous. My throat tightened. "Is it mine?" I asked. Silence followed. Long. Uncomfortable. Painful. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked down at her stomach, her hand resting there protectively once again. Then the headlights grew brighter. Closer. Too close. Her eyes widened. "Go," she whispered. Footsteps approached somewhere behind us, fast. Deliberate? She reached into her pocket suddenly and grabbed my hand, pressing something small into my palm. Cold metal. Rough edges. "What is this?" I asked. "No time," she said urgently. Then she stepped backward into the shadows, disappearing into darkness before I could stop her. The approaching vehicle slowed. My instincts screamed louder than my thoughts. I turned and rushed toward my car, heart pounding violently against my ribs. By the time I reached the driver's seat, the vehicle behind me had stopped near the warehouse entrance. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and drove away before anyone had the chance to step out. Only after turning 3 corners did I finally glance down at my hand. Something small rested in my palm. A metal key. Old. Worn. Attached to it was a tiny numbered tag. No explanation. No instructions. Just a number. And somehow, deep inside, I already knew this key wasn't meant to open a door. It was meant to open the truth. The key felt heavier than it should have, resting cold against my palm as I sat alone in the car under the dim glow of a streetlight. I turned it slowly between my fingers, studying every scratch along its surface. It wasn't new. The metal was worn down around the edges, like it had been used many times before. Attached to it was a small rectangular tag with a number stamped into the steel. No name, no address, just numbers. Whoever handed this to me knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't random. It wasn't panic. It was deliberate. I leaned back into the driver's seat, letting out a slow breath, forcing my thoughts to settle. The image of her face flashed through my mind again, pale, terrified, whispering like every second mattered. "You shouldn't have come." They made sure of it. That single word, "they," echoed louder the more I thought about it. I started the engine and drove slowly through the quiet streets, headlights cutting through empty intersections. Every reflection in my rearview mirror made my pulse tighten. Every passing car felt suspicious. Every shadow felt like it was watching. If she risked giving me this key, then whatever it opened mattered more than fear, more than safety, more than silence. That realization alone told me this wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about survival. The number on the tag didn't match any street address I recognized, but something about its format felt familiar. Industrial. Systematic. Not residential, organized. By the time I reached the edge of the city, I already had a strong suspicion about where I was headed. The storage facility sat near an abandoned stretch of warehouses, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Long rows of identical metal doors stretched into the distance under cold fluorescent lights. The place looked like it hadn't changed in years. Functional. Quiet. Hidden in plain sight. I parked outside the front entrance and stepped out slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots echoing louder than expected. The air smelled faintly of dust and cold steel. A single security camera rotated above the doorway, its lens following movement across the lot with mechanical precision. Watching, always watching. I hesitated only for a second before stepping inside. The interior hallway stretched long and narrow, lit by overhead lights that hummed faintly. Each storage unit door looked exactly the same, gray metal, numbered neatly in black, row after row, endless, uniform. The number on the key burned in my mind as I walked forward, scanning each door carefully. Then I saw it. the matching number, halfway down the corridor. My footsteps slowed automatically. My pulse picked up again. Standing there in front of that door felt different from anything before, heavier, more final, like whatever sat behind that lock had waited years to be found. I lifted the key, paused. For just a second, fear crept into my chest, not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet kind that whispers before everything changes. Then I inserted the key. It turned smoothly, too smoothly, like the lock had been used recently. That thought alone sent a chill down my spine. I pulled the handle and opened the unit slowly. Inside sat a single metal box. Nothing else. No clutter. No storage bins. Just one box placed carefully in the center of the small unit. Waiting. I stepped inside and crouched down in front of it. The metal surface was clean, free of dust, which meant someone had been here not long ago. Maybe her, maybe someone else. A label on the top caught my attention. A legal firm name printed neatly across the surface. Unfamiliar, but official. My chest tightened. I opened the box. Inside were neatly stacked folders, thick, organized, labeled with dates and codes. Each envelope sealed carefully, untouched. The top document made my breath catch. My name, printed clearly across the front. I stared at it for a long moment, unable to move. Then slowly, I broke the seal. Paper slid free beneath my fingers, financial statements, transfer records, legal agreements, pages and pages of transactions, signatures, property transfers. At first, none of it made sense. Just numbers, just legal jargon. Then something caught my eye. A signature. My signature? Except it wasn't. Not exactly. The shape looked similar, but the stroke patterns were wrong. The pressure uneven. Slight differences only someone familiar with his own handwriting would recognize. I leaned closer, studying it carefully. That wasn't mine. Someone had signed my name. A slow wave of realization began creeping into my chest, thick and suffocating. Identity manipulation. Forgery. Fraud. I flipped through more pages, scanning faster now. Transfers. Asset movements. Corporate share reassignments. Large sums shifting between unknown entities. Every date pulled me deeper into memory. And then I saw it. A date that matched the exact week everything in my life began falling apart years ago. The same week my company collapsed under sudden financial pressure. The same week she disappeared. The room felt smaller, air heavier. I closed my eyes for a brief second, and suddenly a memory resurfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. A lawyer arriving unexpectedly at my office. A stack of paperwork placed in front of me. Routine forms, he had said. Nothing unusual. Sign here, and here, and here. I remembered her walking into the room that day, her expression tightening when she saw the documents, her eyes filled with silent alarm. At the time, I thought she was stressed. Now, I realized something else entirely. She had been afraid. I opened my eyes and continued flipping through the folders. Faster now. More documents. More transfers. More unfamiliar company names. Then I saw something else. A trust account. Established shortly after her disappearance. Funded with assets that once belonged to me. My pulse hammered against my ribs. Someone hadn't just ruined my life. Someone had rebuilt theirs with the pieces of mine. At the bottom of the box sat one final envelope. Larger than the rest. Sealed differently. The words printed across the front made my throat tighten. Open only if he returns. He. Not a name. Not initials. Just he. I opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. I lifted it carefully, bringing it closer to the light. Her, standing beside an older man. Well-dressed. Confident. Powerful. His posture alone radiated authority, the kind built on money and control. Her expression wasn't smiling. It wasn't happy. It was tense. Uncomfortable. Afraid. My stomach twisted. Who was he? And why was she standing beside him like that? I stared at the photograph for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything pressing down harder than before. For years, I believed I had been abandoned, left behind, forgotten. But now, standing alone in that cold storage unit, surrounded by proof I never asked for, the truth felt darker than anything I imagined. I hadn't just been left. I had been erased. The photograph stayed under the lamp long after midnight, its edges casting sharp shadows across my desk like it didn't belong to this world anymore. I sat there alone, elbows resting on the wood, staring at the older man's face again and again. There was something about him, not just confidence, not just wealth, but familiarity, the kind that lingered in the back of your mind like a name you almost remembered. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture straight, calculated. The kind of man who expected people to listen when he spoke. The kind who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. And she stood beside him, not smiling, not relaxed, rigid, uncomfortable, like she didn't belong there. I leaned forward, bringing the photograph closer to the light, studying every detail, the background, the angle, the setting. It looked like some kind of formal event, a corporate gathering. Maybe the kind of place filled with investors, executives, men who moved money like pieces on a chessboard. Then it hit me. Not suddenly, not like lightning. Slowly, uncomfortably. I had seen him before, years ago. A conference, a ballroom filled with polished marble floors and expensive suits. I remembered standing near the back of the room, listening to a keynote speaker talk about acquisition strategies and long-term market control. That speaker, him. My chest tightened. I pushed back from the desk and stood, pacing slowly across the room as memories returned in fragments. He had introduced himself briefly afterward, not to everyone, just to a few select business owners. I remembered the handshake clearly now. Firm, controlled, calculated. And the questions, not about my company, not about contracts or performance, about assets, about property ownership, about long-term stability. At the time, I thought he was just another investor scouting opportunities. Now, looking at the photograph again, I realized something far worse. He hadn't been scouting my company. He had been studying me. I returned to the desk and began sorting through the documents again, flipping pages with faster hands now, searching for connections I hadn't noticed before. Names repeated across multiple forms, account numbers tied to unfamiliar corporations, transfer dates aligning with moments that once felt like coincidence, equipment failures, delayed payments, sudden investor withdrawals. None of it looked accidental anymore. I pulled out my laptop and began searching business records, typing the name I now remembered clearly. Within seconds, articles began appearing across the screen. Headlines, profiles, photographs, corporate expansion announcements. There he was, front and center, praised as a visionary investor. A man known for aggressive acquisitions and calculated growth. Powerful, respected, untouchable. The deeper I searched, the more uneasy I became. His companies were everywhere. Real estate, manufacturing, transportation, finance. A network so large it was impossible to track every piece without time and resources I didn't have. Then I noticed something else. One particular transaction record from the storage unit. A transfer connected not just to his companies, but to her family. My hand stilled on the keyboard. I leaned closer, scanning the figures again to be sure. Money, large amounts, deposited into accounts belonging to her relatives. Not once, multiple times. My stomach twisted. That wasn't charity. That wasn't coincidence. That was payment. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. I pushed back from the desk again, pacing across the floor as anger began building beneath the surface. Not loud anger. Not explosive. Cold anger. Controlled. Years ago, I remembered how her family used to treat me, quiet disapproval masked behind polite smiles. They never liked my decisions, never trusted my judgment when business became unstable. They saw weakness where I saw temporary struggle. Now, staring at those transaction dates, a new thought formed, darker than anything before. What if they hadn't just disapproved? What if they had participated? I returned to the documents, flipping pages until I found the timeline that mattered most, the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One transfer date stood out clearly: 3 days before she vanished. Another followed exactly 1 week later, the same week my company collapsed under sudden financial pressure. Coincidence didn't explain patterns like that. Someone had planned this. Carefully. Methodically. I stared at the numbers until my vision blurred slightly. Then another detail caught my attention. A trust account created shortly after she left. Funded with assets that once belonged to me. Protected under corporate legal structures too complex to challenge without proof. Proof I now held in my hands. A cold wave of realization spread through my chest. They didn't just take my money. They built their future from it. I leaned back slowly, pressing my palms against the desk as anger deepened into something sharper. Revenge didn't feel emotional anymore. It felt logical. Necessary. A slow, steady process of reclaiming what was stolen. My eyes drifted back to the photograph once more. That man, standing beside her, watching everything unfold like a game he had already won. But one question still remained. Why her? Why involve her at all? Unless, another thought surfaced, uncomfortable, dangerous. What if she hadn't been helping him willingly? What if she had been forced into silence? I returned to the documents once more, scanning deeper into transaction logs and legal filings. Then I found it, a small entry buried between pages of financial statements. Communication records, linked to her family. Payments issued shortly before official legal paperwork reached my office years ago. Not after. Before. Which meant everything that happened back then had been staged in advance. Prepared. Executed. Not reaction. Strategy. The truth settled into my chest like cold steel. Someone had engineered my downfall. Not because I failed, but because they wanted me removed. My hands curled into fists without me realizing. 8 years of struggle. 8 years rebuilding from nothing. All of it built on lies I never saw coming. Then suddenly, my phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the silence like a warning. Unknown number. No caller ID. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Slowly. Carefully. Hello. Silence filled the line at first. Just faint breathing. Then a voice spoke. Low. Calm. Controlled. You shouldn't be looking into things that belong to him. My blood ran cold. Not because of the words, because of the certainty behind them. Whoever was on the other end knew exactly what I had found, exactly what I was holding, and exactly how dangerous this had become. The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the dark screen. For years, I believed my life collapsed because of bad decisions. Bad timing. Bad luck. But now, sitting alone in that silent room, surrounded by proof of deception and power, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't betrayal by chance. This was betrayal by design. The voice from the phone call lingered in my mind long after the line went dead, repeating itself like an echo that refused to fade. You shouldn't be looking into things that belong to him. I sat motionless at my desk, staring at the scattered documents in front of me. The photograph lay under the lamp, the older man's expression calm and confident, as if he already knew how this would end. My pulse slowed, but not because I felt safer, because something inside me had shifted. Fear wasn't gone. It had hardened, turned into focus. I picked up my phone again and checked the time. It was late, but not too late. If I waited longer, hesitation would grow. Questions would multiply. Doubt would creep in. No, this couldn't wait. I grabbed the folder of documents and slipped it into a leather case, locking it carefully. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt heavier than it should have. Final. I drove back toward the restaurant district with headlights cutting through the quiet streets. Every intersection felt sharper, more deliberate. Every shadow looked like something hiding just out of sight. When I reached the restaurant, it was nearly closing time. Only a few tables remained occupied. Staff moving slower now, cleaning surfaces and stacking chairs, but she was still there. I saw her immediately, standing near the counter, wiping down a table with mechanical movements, her shoulders tense even from across the room. She noticed me seconds later, and froze. Not dramatically, not loudly, just still. Like prey sensing danger. I walked toward the counter slowly, careful not to draw attention. I need to talk to her, I said quietly to the manager. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved from me to her, then back again. Suspicion flashed across his face, not confusion, not irritation. Calculation. Make it quick, he said finally. No warmth, no friendliness, just warning. She walked toward me slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach again. Protective, always protective. We can't talk here, she whispered. Then where? I asked. Her eyes scanned the room quickly before settling on the narrow hallway behind the kitchen. Back room, she said. No hesitation, just urgency. We moved quickly through the hallway, past stacked boxes and metal shelves, until we reached a small storage room barely large enough for 2 people to stand comfortably. She shut the door behind us, then locked it. That alone told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about survival. I placed the leather case on a nearby table and opened it slowly, one by one. I laid the documents out in front of her. The photograph came last, the moment her eyes landed on his face. Her entire body stiffened. Her hand flew to her mouth, covering a sudden intake of breath. You know him, I said quietly. Not a question, a statement. Her silence lasted only seconds, but it felt much longer. Then she whispered his name. Soft, barely audible, but enough. Confirmation. The room felt colder instantly. Tell me everything, I said. Her shoulders dropped slightly, like the weight she'd been carrying had grown too heavy to hold any longer. You weren't supposed to find those, she whispered. I wasn't supposed to lose everything either, I replied. That hit harder than I expected. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. They paid them, she said suddenly. Who? My family, she answered. The words landed heavy between us. They were drowning in debt, she continued. Medical bills, loans, everything falling apart. Then he appeared, offering help. Help. That word twisted in my chest. Not free help, I said. She shook her head slowly. No, she whispered. Nothing from him is free. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for one of the documents on the table. He paid their debts, she said. Every single one. And in return, they agreed to cooperate. Cooperate. The meaning was clear without explanation. And you? I asked. Her breathing grew uneven. I didn't know at first, she said. Not until they told me what they needed. Her voice cracked slightly. They needed your signature on certain documents. They said it was temporary, harmless. My jaw tightened. Forgery disguised as routine paperwork. They told me if I refused, she continued, her voice dropping lower, they would take everything back. Not just the money. The protection. Protection. From what? They were scared, she added quietly. Terrified. And I thought I could handle it. That it wouldn't hurt you. Her eyes dropped to the floor. But it did, she whispered. I didn't speak. Couldn't? Because the pieces were finally falling into place. You disappeared, I said. Her head lifted slightly. I didn't leave because I wanted to, she replied. They arranged everything. Transportation. Housing. New job. My stomach tightened. You were watched, I said. She nodded once. Always. The words settled into the room like smoke. And the child? I asked quietly. Silence followed. Long. Heavy. She looked down at her stomach. her hand resting there again. Protective. Careful. Then she looked back at me. This child is yours. The words hit harder than anything else she had said. For a second, the room felt smaller, quieter, like the world had shifted beneath my feet. Mine. Not theory. Not suspicion. Fact. A slow rush of emotion surged through my chest. Shock. Disbelief. Fear. And something deeper. Responsibility. You should have told me, I said quietly. I couldn't, she replied instantly. Not without risking everything. Her voice trembled again. He watches everything. Every movement. Every connection. If he suspected I contacted you. She stopped mid-sentence. A sudden sound interrupted us. A sharp knock against the door. Both of us froze instantly. Her eyes widened. Mine locked on the handle. Another knock followed. Louder this time. Claire. A voice called from outside. The false name again. Her breathing became shallow. Fast. She grabbed my wrist tightly. You have to leave, she whispered urgently. Not yet, I replied. Yes, she insisted. If they find you here. The handle rattled slightly. Testing. Waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears. For the first time since all of this began, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about money, or betrayal, or revenge. This was about survival. And the war that had started years ago had never truly ended. The door handle rattled again, harder this time, and every muscle in my body locked into place. She tightened her grip on my wrist, her fingers cold and trembling. Stay quiet, she whispered, barely moving her lips. Another knock. Louder. More impatient. Claire. The voice called again from outside. You still in there? Her eyes darted toward the scattered documents on the table. Without hesitation, she grabbed the photograph and folders, sliding them back into my case with frantic precision. Behind the shelves, she mouthed. I moved quickly, stepping behind a stack of metal containers just as the lock clicked open. The door swung inward. A man stepped inside, tall, broad shoulders, wearing a dark jacket that looked more suited for watching people than serving food. His eyes scanned the room slowly, deliberately. I stayed still, barely breathing. He looked at her first. What are you doing back here? He asked. Cleaning inventory, she replied, her voice steady but tight. His gaze shifted across the room, past the table, past the walls, toward the shelves, toward me. For one long second, I thought he saw me, but then he looked away. Manager said to finish up, he said. We're closing soon. She nodded. I will. He lingered at the doorway, his posture stiff, suspicious. Then finally, he stepped back and pulled the door shut behind him. The lock clicked again. Silence followed. Heavy. Tense. Neither of us moved for several seconds. When I finally stepped out from behind the shelves, she exhaled shakily, pressing her hand against her chest. That wasn't a customer, I said quietly. She shook her head. No. The fear in her eyes hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. They check on me sometimes, she admitted. Make sure I follow instructions. Instructions. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. We can't keep running, I said. She looked at me like I had just said something impossible. What choice do we have? She whispered. We stop reacting, I replied. We start planning. The words felt strange leaving my mouth. Not reckless. Not emotional. Strategic. Cold. Necessary. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto one of the stacked crates. The exhaustion in her posture made her look smaller than ever. There isn't much time, she said. What do you mean? She swallowed, then met my eyes again. He's preparing something big, she said. A financial takeover? A company acquisition. My chest tightened. What company? She hesitated, clearly debating whether to say it. Then she did. The name hit me like a punch. I knew that company. Not just casually. Personally. Years ago. It had been partially mine before everything collapsed. Before my shares disappeared under legal confusion, I never fully understood. They're finalizing the deal soon, she continued. Within days. Within days. That meant everything happening now wasn't random. It was timing. Precision. Preparation. I opened the leather case again and pulled out the documents we had reviewed earlier. My eyes moved quickly across signatures. Dates. Transfer amounts. Then I saw it. A line buried between financial records. An authorization form. The same document I remembered signing years ago. The one that transferred partial control under the promise of temporary restructuring. Except now I saw what I hadn't before. A second signature line. Unauthorized. Invalid. Hidden in legal language designed to confuse. My breathing slowed as realization settled in. This isn't just theft, I said quietly. It's fraud. She leaned forward slightly. You can prove it. Yes, I answered. The word came easier than expected. Because for the first time, the fear inside me had something to fight with. Evidence. Facts. Truth. I closed the folder and looked at her directly. I know someone, I said. A lawyer I trust? Someone who won't be intimidated. She didn't respond immediately. Fear still lingered in her expression, mixed now with something else. Hope. Small. Fragile. Dangerous. Even if we prove it, she whispered. He won't let it go quietly. I don't expect him to, I replied. Silence followed again. Then she spoke. Quieter than before. There's something else, she said. What? She shifted slightly, her hand resting once again over her stomach. The acquisition isn't just about money, she continued. It's about control. Control of what? She hesitated again, longer this time. Properties, she said. Land. Assets connected to your old company. My jaw tightened. That confirmed everything. He hadn't just ruined my life. He had built his empire from its ashes. I stood slowly, pacing across the room, thoughts racing faster than words. This wasn't chaos anymore. It was structure. Pattern. Opportunity. If he's finalizing this deal soon, I said, then that gives us leverage. She frowned slightly. How? Because if we expose the fraud before the transfer completes, I paused, letting the idea fully form. The entire acquisition collapses. Her eyes widened slightly. That would destroy him, she whispered. Not destroy. Expose. Reveal. Return what was stolen. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling quickly through contacts until I found the name I needed. A lawyer who had stood beside me once before everything fell apart. Before I lost control. Before I lost her. I pressed the call button. The line rang once. Twice. Then answered. I need your help, I said without hesitation. There was no turning back now. Not after everything we had uncovered. Not after everything we had survived. Later that night, after leaving the building, I noticed something again. Headlights. Parked across the street. Not moving. Not leaving. Watching. The same car that had followed me days earlier. The message was clear. They were paying attention. But this time, fear didn't rise the way it had before. Instead, something else settled deep inside me. Resolve. Cold. Focused. Dangerous. My phone buzzed with a message seconds later. Unknown number. Short. Direct. If you attend tomorrow's hearing, you will regret it. I stared at the screen, reading the words twice. Then locked the phone and slid it into my pocket. For years, they believed silence made me weak. They believed fear would keep me obedient. But now silence had turned into evidence. And evidence had turned into power. The morning of the hearing arrived colder than I expected. The kind of cold that settled deep into your bones and refused to leave. I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my tie for the third time. Even though it was already straight, My reflection looked older than it had just weeks ago. Harder. Sharper. Like the man staring back at me had learned too much in too little time. Behind me, she stood quietly near the doorway, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "You don't have to come," I said without turning. "I do," she replied softly. There was no hesitation in her voice this time. No fear that froze her movements. Just quiet determination, the kind that comes from surviving too long in silence. I picked up the leather case from the table, feeling its familiar weight settle into my hand. Inside were the documents that had taken years to surface. Signatures, transfer records, forged authorizations. Proof of a plan designed to erase me completely. Proof that silence had been their greatest weapon. And today, it would become mine. The courthouse stood tall against the gray sky. Its stone steps crowded with people moving quickly in every direction. Lawyers in dark suits, assistants carrying folders, reporters speaking into microphones. Noise. Movement. Pressure. Exactly the kind of place where truth could either explode or disappear forever. We walked up the steps together, neither of us speaking. Her fingers brushed lightly against my arm once, not to hold, not to stop me, just to remind me she was still there. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Security guards watched carefully as we passed through the metal detectors. My grip tightened slightly on the case. But I didn't slow down. Not now. Not after everything. When we entered the hearing room, I saw him immediately, standing near the front, speaking calmly with two men in expensive suits. His posture was the same as in the photograph, straight, confident, untouchable, until his eyes found mine. Recognition flashed across his face, followed quickly by something colder, amusement. He stepped away from the men beside him and approached slowly. "You should have stayed silent," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I met his gaze without flinching. "You should have stayed honest," I replied. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, subtle, but visible. Then the hearing began. Lawyers moved into position. Documents were passed forward. The judge entered, commanding silence with a single glance. The room settled, still, heavy. My attorney stood first, opening the case with steady hands. One by one, he laid the evidence on the table: financial records, ownership transfers, corporate filings. Each page told a story. Each number revealed a lie. The first reactions came slowly, whispers among observers, shifting posture among legal teams. Nothing dramatic at first, just quiet tension building beneath the surface. Then came the timeline, projected onto a screen for everyone to see. Years of transactions mapped across dates I knew too well. The week my company collapsed. The day my assets were transferred. The moment my name disappeared from ownership records. The room changed instantly. People leaned forward. Whispers grew louder. His lawyers shifted uncomfortably. And he, the man who once stood beside her in that photograph, remained motionless, his expression tightening just enough to betray the first hint of pressure. "These transfers," my attorney said clearly, "were authorized under forged signatures and unlawful authority." The word "forged" echoed across the room like a crack in glass. Then came the final document. The one she had hidden. The one she risked everything to protect. My attorney lifted it carefully. "This authorization," he continued, "contains signature inconsistencies verified by independent analysis. The evidence appeared on screen, side-by-side comparisons of handwriting patterns. Stroke pressure, spacing, proof. Undeniable, unavoidable." A murmur swept through the room. His composure cracked. "Just slightly, but enough. I object," one of his attorneys called sharply. The judge raised a hand. "Objection noted," he said calmly. "Continue." Momentum shifted in that moment. You could feel it, like a storm changing direction. More documents followed. More timelines. More connections linking his companies to fraudulent transfers and illegal asset restructuring. Then came the final blow. Authorities entered the room quietly, stepping toward his side of the table. Not loudly, not dramatically, just deliberately, controlled. One of them leaned toward him and spoke quietly. His face lost color. For the first time, the man who once seemed untouchable looked uncertain, vulnerable. The hearing ended not with applause, not with shouting, but with something far more powerful. Silence. Heavy, undeniable silence that followed truth finally being spoken aloud. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, like something that had weighed on my chest for years had finally been lifted. We stood on the steps together, watching the crowd disperse around us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she turned toward me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not for revenge, not for winning, for believing." Her hand moved again to her stomach. And this time, I placed my hand gently over hers. The future wasn't clear yet. Legal battles would continue. Consequences would unfold. Rebuilding wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. Not perfect. Not easy. Possible. As we walked down the courthouse steps together, sunlight broke through the clouds above, warming the cold stone beneath our feet. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. The greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's restoration. It's reclaiming what was taken and refusing to let fear define your ending. Later that evening, back at home, I placed the final stack of documents into a locked drawer and sat quietly by the window, watching the last light of day fade across the horizon. Peace didn't arrive loudly. It settled in slowly, quietly, like truth finally finding its way home. If you've ever faced betrayal, if you've ever been forced to question everything you once trusted, then you know how heavy silence can feel. And maybe you've wondered what you would do if the truth finally appeared in front of you. Would you walk away? Or would you fight for it? I'd like to hear what you think. If you were standing where I stood, holding proof that could change everything, would you have taken the risk? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that courage matters, that truth is worth fighting for, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts, and keep listening. And because sometimes the stories we carry aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that even after years of silence, justice still has a way of finding its voice.